I saw this story in the news not too long ago. It said a flight was reportedly diverted after a woman unlocks her husband's phone and uncovers an affair. Now, why would that need to cause a flight to be diverted? Well, apparently while the flight was going on, her husband was asleep in the seat next to her on the plane. And she reached over. You know how iPhones, they have a thumbprint scanner thing?
Oh, yeah. But you don't have to use it.
Well, you don't have to use it. Her husband actually did. He had his phone locked to his thumbprint. And she reached over and pushed the phone onto his thumb and got into his phone. And it said, I took these pictures on my phone. This was months ago, but I took these pictures on my phone, so I still had them. Woman who accessed her husband's phone using his fingerprint found out he was cheating, caused a mid-flight emergency. The Qatar Airways flight they were traveling on was forced to make an emergency landing in India after she started to repeatedly hit her husband following the discovery. So I thought this was great. Just imagining this in my mind. And flight attendants tried to intervene, but were unable to calm her down, leaving the pilots no option but to make an unscheduled stop. So when I read that, I have a feeling that the marriage probably did not last much longer after the flight got down on the ground. Would you guys agree with me? The marriage is probably pretty much over by then. All right, tonight I want to talk about marriage and divorce. And I'm going to talk about something that... The same thing, just opposite. You're right. I want to talk about something that duct tape cannot fix.
Life.
My sister used to say that duct tape... Well, they say duct tape can fix everything. That or WD-40.
Oh,
and my sister used to say that duct tape and WD-40 will fix anything you need in life, any problem you have. WD-40 will make the things stop sticking that are, and duct tape will make the things stick that won't. That's what she used to tell me. So I thought that was pretty good. So what are some of the things that we have at a wedding? Why don't you think about, what are the things that, I'm going to put them up here. What are some of the things that we see at a wedding? Okay, well, when you have a wedding, you have a bride and a groom, and they dress up in these, nice clothes. The bride wears a white dress. The husband, the groom gets a tux, all right? They get flowers. So then the bride carries the bouquet of flowers, all right? They usually play the song as the bride's walking down the aisle. Here comes the bride. I don't know the rest. They stand up in front of the preacher guy and they say some words. They say the vows. Do you take this man? Do you take this woman? I do. I do. Then they go to the reception and they have some cake. Let's say that a couple, though, they're going to have their wedding and they decide they don't want a cake. They want to put a pie in. They want to have wedding pie. Can they do that?
Pie on.
You guys say no. If they do all this, is it still a wedding?
Yes.
If they decide they want a pie instead of a cake, it's still a wedding, right? Okay. What if they decide, they just don't want to carry flowers as they're going down the aisle? That's just not their thing. They don't like, the bride may be allergic to flowers. Can they do all this? Can they still have a wedding?
Yeah.
Okay. What if they decide, instead of walking down to Here Comes the Bride, let's say they pick, Forever by Chris Brown. Okay?
Yes.
Can they still have a wedding?
Yes.
They can still have an awesome wedding then, right? Let's say instead of getting married in a church and a dress and a tux, they want to get married. Let's say they want to get married on the beach, okay? And they're wearing sandals and a skirt. Can they still have a wedding?
Yes.
Okay.
That's what my dad did.
What if they decide, what if they say they'll do the tux, they'll do the flowers, they'll do the song, they'll do the cake, but they say, let's just skip the vows, let's just walk down the aisle, shake the preacher's hand, and then go have cake. Can they still have a wedding though? No. Okay, thank you. That's what I was building up to. Let's focus, guys. They could leave out all that other stuff, but if you don't have the vows, you don't have a wedding, right? We all know this deep down in our hearts. The wedding, it's not about all that other stuff. It's not even about the cake. That might be what we're looking forward to the most when we go to one. But it's not about all that stuff. It's about the vows. That's what makes someone married. Okay, so I want to talk this week about marriage. And marriage is something that shows up in the Bible all the way up in the first 2 chapters of the Bible. It talks about marriage. Genesis 2:24, a man leaves his father and mother, is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. Now, as long as a man and a woman are married on this earth, the Bible says they're one flesh. It doesn't say they're one soul. It doesn't say they're one spirit. It says they're one flesh. And so that means this is something that pertains to the earth. As long as they are both alive on this earth, they are one flesh, they are one unit together. That was God's original idea for marriage. But I'm going to tell you about something tonight. And after I tell you about this tonight, I want you to never think about it again. Okay? After I give you this sermon, when I'm done, I want you to never think about it again. Can you do that? That's what you usually do with my sermons anyway, right? I'm going to tell you tonight about divorce. Here is what the Old Testament said about divorce, and it's going to be kind of confusing. I'll explain it whenever I'm done. But this is what the Old Testament of the Bible, this is what Moses wrote. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and gives it to her, and sends her from his house, and if after she leaves his house, she becomes the wife of another man, and her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce and gives it to her and sends her from his house, or if he dies, and this is confusing, but I'll explain it all, then her first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again after she's been defiled. That would be detestable in the eyes of the Lord. Now, I know that's kind of confusing. What are they saying about marriage here? In God's view, once the man and woman say the vows to each other, they are married. Even if they just write a certificate of divorce, as they would call it, even if they would just give that, in God's eyes, they're actually still married. Yeah, when you get married, you get to have a marriage certificate. And in modern terms, when we talk about divorce, people go to lawyers or a court and they get a new certificate that says they're no longer married legally. But in God's eyes, guys, they're actually still married, because once two people have made the vows, they're still married to each other. So what are these verses saying? These verses here are saying if a man gives his wife a certificate of divorce, basically it means they are officially separated. But they're actually technically, in God's eyes, still married. So, the husband gives the wife a certificate of divorce, they're not getting along for some reason, and she takes that and goes and marries someone else. What this law is saying, if she goes and does that and actually marries another man, she can never go back to her first husband. And it's saying about this husband, he can never go marry another woman. So it says, hey, you can do this certificate of divorce if you guys are fighting, not getting along, and you want to separate, but you can't just go marry someone else, because in God's view, they're still married. And the Bible says that because she says she might go to this second husband, and then he might get tired of her, and he might say, I want to give you a certificate of divorce too. What the Bible's saying is, she can't just go back to her first. That's what people do sometimes. They won't get along with their husband or wife. So they say, well, I just want to be with so-and-so. He would treat me right. She would treat me well. And they want to run off with this other person. But then when they run to this other person, they realize that they still have some other issues. This person's not Mr. Perfect like they thought he'd be. They're not as great as they thought he'd be. So they want to go back to the first husband or wife. And God says, you can't do that. You stick with who you're with. If you try to go get with someone else, you guys aren't supposed to be married to anyone else ever again. You need to stay together. And that was God's view of marriage all the time. But because of these verses where it just says, give them a certificate of divorce and send them away, people got the wrong idea about marriage. They thought it meant, oh, well, if I want to get a divorce, I just get a certificate of divorce and just send them on their way. I don't need to do anything. That's all that it takes. And they thought marriage wasn't really all that important, that you don't have to stay with someone, you just give them a letter. Okay? Now, back when we get to the time of Jesus, then they had a whole new standard for how they would do divorce. They called it the burn the bread standard in Jesus' time. And this was the burn the bread standard. By the time you get to Jesus' day, they had just taken the certificate of divorce idea so crazy that they said, you know what? If you don't like your wife, if she just burns the bread one day, you just give her a certificate of divorce and send her out. They'd say, they would just set the bar that low where they'd say, you know what? That's all it would take. Burn the bread, you're out of here. At our house, we have a burn the Snuggie standard. But no, not really. She just threatens to quite a bit. So they got the wrong idea about this. They thought, oh, certificate of divorce. Well, okay. All he has to do is write her a letter. And they say, well, why did she write the letter? She burned the bread this morning. That's all it would take. And they'd say, okay, sounds like a good reason for a divorce. So they got completely the wrong idea about it. What the verses were saying all along, it's not about a certificate. It's not about what the legal things say. In God's eyes, when you say the vows to someone, you are married to them. You are still with them. Even if you write a letter, even if they burn the bread, that doesn't change it. You're still married in God's eyes. So listen, someday whenever you get married, don't even think about divorce. Someday whenever you get married, just don't even think about divorce. And I'll say something else before, I'm talking about divorce tonight. Listen, if you have a parent or a family member who's gotten divorced, I'm not asking you to judge them. I'm not judging them. I'm not going to. Divorce has got to be one of the most painful things I can even imagine. Nobody goes and gets married and thinks, well, I might just get a divorce someday. No one thinks that when they're getting married. So nobody would choose to want that to happen. I'm not speaking, if you have a family member, a parent even, who's been divorced, I'm not telling you to judge them or go home and beat them over the head with these verses. I want you to think about for yourself what you're going to do someday. And someday, whenever you get married, I want you to never even think about divorce, okay? So I said that in the days of Jesus, they had this burn the bread standard. That's what they had gotten to, all right? That's not what God wanted marriage to be like. God wanted it to be very, very, very hard for a couple to get divorced. In America, it used to be very, very difficult for people to get divorced. Up until about the 1960s. That wasn't mine, was it?
No,
All right.
it was
Up until about the 1960s. And then they started signing in what are called no-fault divorce laws. And no-fault divorce laws mean, it used to be that if a married couple wanted to get divorced, they would actually have to prove that there was a good reason for it. They'd have to go to court and be like, this is, we want to get divorced, and they'd have to prove they had a good reason to get divorced, or else it wouldn't go through. In the 1960s, they changed it to no-fault divorce. You don't have to have a reason anymore. You can just say, even she burned the bread, and that's all you got to do. Ronald Reagan was the first governor to sign a no-fault divorce law when he was governor of California in 1969. He later said that was one of the biggest mistakes of his life. Now, it's kind of hard to get statistics on divorce because not all states got no-fault divorce at the same time. They got them at different times. But over the next decade, mostly all the states got no-fault divorce, okay? So I'll show you just a little bit. These are kind of rounded statistics. A couple married in 1950 had about a 20% chance of ever getting divorced, okay? A couple married in 1970 had about a 50% chance. So just in that span of time, the couples who got married, the rate of divorce more than doubled once they actually put in a burn the bread standard. They said, hey, if your wife just burns the bread, you can divorce her. That's kind of how the laws are in our America now. And people get divorced quite often. It's pretty common that people get divorced. So when a couple thinks that the only thing that their marriage is a piece of paper, it doesn't seem that important to them anymore. They don't think it's that big of a deal. But according to Jesus, according to God, marriage is not about a piece of paper. It's about the vows that two people make. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Do you guys remember what adultery is? It's whenever someone cheats on their husband or wife. Jesus said that when two people get divorced, if they go and marry someone else, in God's eyes, they're committing adultery. Because in God's eyes, they're still married to their first spouse. Just because they got a piece of paper that said they were divorced. In God's eyes, that doesn't cut it. Jesus said the only reason you can get a divorce is if someone already has committed adultery. If someone already does that, then Jesus said, you know what, we will allow it in that case. But other than that, Jesus said no divorce. So when you get married someday, if you want to have a Christian marriage, like if you want to say, hey, I want to do this God's way, I want to have a marriage that honors God, I want to have a life that honors God, I'm a Christian, so I follow God, then whenever you get married, don't even think about divorce, okay? If you're fighting or having a problem and you're trying to think of a way to solve it, don't think in your head, well, maybe this just won't work out. Maybe I should just get a divorce. Don't suggest divorce as an answer to your problems. And I'm saying all this to you guys because I know you're not married yet. Okay, the only married people in here are Cody and Emily and me, because I'm married to Emily. So, I mean, we still got the Snuggie at home, don't we? Why would I preach about marriage to teenagers who are not even married? This is the time when you need to hear it the most. Because you might get married someday. So someday whenever you're married, I want you to be prepared. I want you to be thinking, this is how I'm going to do it. Don't suggest divorce as an answer to your problems. Don't threaten your husband or wife with, say, well, if you don't do this, I'm going to divorce you. Never say something like that, okay? If you have kids someday, don't even let them think that there's a possibility that mom and dad might get divorced, okay? Because and I don't know you guys' stories. Some of you may have had parents who got divorced, and if they did, I'm really sorry to hear that. I'm lucky because, when I was a kid and I was going to public school, my parents weren't divorced, but I remember in my classes, my classmates, if I just looked around the room, most of the kids in the room came from homes where the mom and dad weren't together anymore, or maybe they were never even married, or maybe they were divorced. So listen, I know it's really common. I know when you've had parents who've been divorced, it could create a lot of anger for you. It could be really hard to forgive them. But let me just say all this. I'm not telling you about these verses tonight so we can judge other people or beat them over the head with the verses. I'm telling it to you because I want you to decide for yourself what you're going to do someday whenever you get married. And hopefully that is to never, ever think about divorce. Whenever I got married, I decided the day before I got married, I'm not even going to ever think about divorce. I'm not going to ever talk about divorce. I've said that word more tonight than I've ever said it in my life, probably, just by preaching about it. Yeah, I know. I've been talking about it all night. But, yeah, it feels really weird because to me that's almost like a bad word. I feel like I'm cursing up here or something because that's not a word I even think about. But listen, guys, when you get married, I want you to not even think. If you don't think about it, you're not going to do it. So let me show you what I got the duct tape for. Mikey, take this piece of duct tape. Actually, let me show you what I'm going to do with them. This is what marriage is, guys. Look at the duct tape here. This is what marriage is, okay? It's taking two pieces of duct tape. You're taking two things and you're fusing them together into one. All right? I want you to rip those in half. Not like this, but separate them on the sticky part.
That's easy.
Can you do that for me?
Braiding fingers.
Yeah.
Where's the scissors at?
Do you guys see how hard it is to rip those apart? See how when two things fuse together like that? What's it if you actually could even rip those apart? What would happen to them? Would they be all mangled?
Yes.
Would
And
they-
then you couldn't reuse them.
Would they still be sticky anymore?
No.
No, they'd be all screwed up. Could you use it for anything? Okay. No, Mikey, you did fine. You don't have to rip it up anymore. That's fine. So you guys see how two things that fuse together like that, they're not meant to come back apart. Okay. Let me show you something up here. About 50%, okay? That's about half of marriages. Shh, listen, guys. About half of marriages end in divorce, okay? But whenever someone divorces and then marries again, okay? Let's imagine that we just took the tape and ripped it apart and then put it back together, okay? If someone divorces and then marries again, is that tape going to be as sticky? No. When people get divorced and then marry someone else, do you think their marriages survive more often or less often? Less often, yeah. 75% of second marriages will end in divorce, okay? Let's say that someone gets divorced twice and marries someone else.
Oh, wow.
Okay? Do you think that third marriage is going to be third time's the charm, is it going to finally hold together? Most likely. 80% of third marriages end in divorce. That seems too extreme to even think about. If someone got married 3 times, wouldn't it finally stick that time? I have a relative who's been married 5 times. I have another one who's been married 4 times. Okay? You'd think it would finally stick. Sometimes it does, but 80% of third marriages end in divorce. If you go to a couple and who's considering divorce, and you ask them to stay together, 85% of the time, people who were considering divorce and stuck it out were glad that they did whenever they were interviewed 10 years later. So listen, do you want to know how to never get divorced?
Never get married.
That's one way, but that's not what I was... You want to know how to never get divorced?
Never meet.
Divorce will never happen if you never even think about it.
Don't take it.
Okay?
Just clap your hands
So
to each
after tonight, just never even think about divorce again.